the last day or so in the hospital. He went on, I believe, Friday it was, with some heart issues. They kind of kept him. They've worked with him. They've given him some different types of treatments or what have you. But his heart was out of rhythm. But I think that they've got that fixed. I talked with him last night. He said that they thought everything was good, but they wanted to keep him overnight. And then I was just told that he's, I think, on his way home right now. So I think, was he in Danville? Yeah. So he and Melvina had been, I think, contemplating a little weekend trip. And I was going to teach the class this morning if he was going to be gone. And he texted me the other night and he said, well, to teach the class, but it's not the trip that I was planning on taking. So, but hopefully he'll be able to be back. It was that AFib type deal, which of course Carolyn had that. So there's probably some genetic things in that as well. But continue to keep being in your prayers, and hopefully a few days of rest, and he can kind of maybe be back into. Anything else before we start? All right. Hit the wrong button. Well, we're indeed glad you're here, Dick and Glenda. Glad that you are here. Jimmy, we've always liked when you're here, but you dropped down the pole this morning with when you carried Jameson in. That moved you down the line there just a little bit. That just needed to be said. I'm sorry. Today we are talking about the book of Hebrews, and we are working our way through the Bible. We're almost to the end. This did not. I really wish Ben was here, but this didn't work. It kind of worked out fairly well because I think when we're going to be gone this summer, this will get us through like first, second, third John. So by teaching a random Sunday somewhere, which is what this one is. So we're progressing along, and but we've got quite a bit we're going to look at today. So we're going to work our way through. I thought this was a fitting sort of title page for what we're going to talk about with Hebrews. Our focus is going to be in chapters 8 and chapter 9. For turning over there, you can. We're going to read through both 8 and 9 sort of as we go, kind of similar to our Wednesday night type process. I got a few questions that we'll ask. I've also tried to put some type of picture after each set of verses that maybe works with what we've been talking about. As always, these are artistic renderings and various different things, but hopefully it'll tie into what we've been talking about as well. But again, this is Hebrews chapter 8 and Hebrews chapter 9. Another of the letters believed, I don't know, I think some people strongly believe it was written by Paul. I don't know if I'm as strongly a believer of that as some other people are, but nonetheless, the reason why there's belief and doubt in that is because it's the rare letter that doesn't say this was written to so-and-so by so-and-so. The book of Hebrews, when we use the word Hebrew, what are we talking about? Who are Hebrew people? They're Jewish people. And so it's a letter directed to them. And so this is something that the Jewish people, whom lineage had provided, he had come out of that, and a lot of the Hebrew people had been unreceptive of Jesus. They had not wanted Jesus to be to be considered the Messiah, and there were Jewish people that were there when Jesus was killed in the process. Of course, there were also Jewish people that made up the first church. The first Christians came out of Judaism, so you've got. It's easy for us to sometimes say, well, all these people are like that, right? It's easy to say that all women do this or all men, but that's never right. And it's not, if it can become easy, I think, in the Old Testament to say, well, the Jewish people all did that. We got to remember, this is millions of people. You can't get your 2 kids to do the same thing, much less millions of people. And so this letter is written in a general sense to the Hebrew people, but not all the Hebrew people would have been affected, I guess, in the same way as what we would try to say. So let's talk first, or let's read first. This is Hebrews chapter 8, the first 6 verses. Everything is on the screen, of course, but then also if you feel more comfortable reading it out of your Bible, then we can do that as well. Let's see. Dad, do you want to read the first 6 verses there?
Now, this is the main point of the things we are saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle, which the Lord erected and not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore, it is necessary that this one also having something to offer. For if he were here on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things. As Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. But now he has attained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises.
How many of you have ever been maybe telling a story or explaining something or talking to somebody, and you've talked for a little while, and then you said, all right, now, this is what I'm trying to get at, right? You've sort of got, well, that's where we see this. We pick up here in chapter 8. So there's 7 chapters of the book of Hebrews before we get into chapter 8. And the first thing that we read here from the writer says, now this is the main point of the things, plural, we are saying. When he says that this is the main point right there, what is his main point? What do we need to take from that there at the beginning? Okay. Jesus is the perfect high priest. You'll remember, and we'll talk about it a little more here in just a second, but the high priest was sort of the highest ranking official, if you want to use that word, religious leader, whatever you want to say. But the priest was a human, and he was entrusted to dies, and you got to get a new person that's in there as have to be. And that high priest wasn't infallible. They weren't perfect. They were just the person who came through the tribe of Levi to be able to be that. And so Jesus, though, was a better or a greater, whatever term you want to use, as a high priest. Now, why is that so important? Why does this need to be referenced right from the get-go to the Hebrew people, that Jesus is a greater, better high priest than any other high priest that there had been? The Old Testament would be done away with. Why else? Any other reasons why? He was perfect, okay? I would imagine, just like with anything, there were probably Hebrew people that had remembered certain high priests. And there were some that you can almost guarantee that they thought were great, and some, I didn't really care for. You probably think that way about preachers, boss, politicians, whomever it might would be, right? But we can kind of rank those. But this and all of them, right? Nothing personal against these people, but Jesus is better. And so that's being referenced. That's the main point right there. Now, a little bit later, they mention the true tabernacle in verse 2, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord erected, not a man. What is the true tabernacle in verse 2? The church, okay? It is the church. The tabernacle, if you remember way back when we first started these lessons, we talked about the tabernacle, right? I think it was in the book of Leviticus that it laid out exactly how you to set it up, and then you'd pack up and you'd move a little further on. You had to set it up, and these tribes had to be there, but that was made by man, right? But the true tabernacle, is there a moving and packing it up? And no, it's the church. It was created that everyone could be part of. Now, why could Jesus not serve as a priest on earth? All right, so we'll be technical. Yeah, he wasn't part of the tribe of Levi. That's a very important point. Why else? His kingdom was not of this world. Very good. Any other thoughts? What did the priests do? What did they do? They offered animal sacrifices. Was Jesus in the business of offering those kinds of sacrifices? What kind of sacrifice does Jesus offer? He offers himself, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second as well. So that was not even a job that Jesus was qualified for. Jesus couldn't do. In some ways, he was underqualified because he didn't meet the requirements, but in other words, he was overqualified. You ever worked with somebody who was underqualified for the job they're doing? You ever work with somebody who was overqualified for the job they're doing? Why were they doing the job? Yeah, how does they need to do? They probably needed a job to make money, and the business needed a person to do that employee. Well, this is a rare case here where Jesus sort of was very different from both. He was not these high priests that they talked about. Now, we go a little bit further in the reading there a little bit. How was Moses instructed to build the tabernacle? God had spoke to him. If we go way, way, way back into the Old Testament, we see that instruction by God. Okay? Now, yes. Yeah. It would be, yeah, I can't remember. I got two things to do after church. I can't remember either one of them. So I guess importance factors in there. Right. If you think about all the things that you remember and then rank them by importance, you'll figure out that song lyrics from when you're in high school was right up here. They're the most important thing because you remember all of them. Birthdays and anniversaries, they're not near as important. They go down here near the bottom. But that is a good point. Memory, I guess, played a big role. All right, so in comparison to that of the law of Moses, what kind of ministry then would Jesus have? Because they were very different. What was Moses's, I hesitate to use the word ministry, but I'll use it.
Well, the Mosaic law, they had to continuously, daily, weekly, yearly, offer sacrifice.
Okay.
Jesus would make one sacrifice at one time.
Good, okay. So the method and the importance of sacrifice was totally different. What else? What?
The new law is the spiritual law.
Okay.
More concerned with the heart and mind as opposed to the physical law. You could keep the old law very, very well.
Okay.
Even though you wouldn't do it perfect, you could still keep it very, very well. Even though you hate it.
Yes.
I hate this.
Sure.
I don't do it anyway.
Sure.
But I really hate it. And it was okay. But in the New Testament, you have to embrace the law.
Would we describe Moses in the Old Testament as a preacher? I don't know that there's I don't know that anybody in the Old Testament was really a preacher in the sense that we say, because was Moses's task converting other people? Moses was the leader of who? The Jewish people. And those people were the Jewish people. They were born into that. What was Jesus's task? Was there any requirement for anyone to follow Jesus? Requirement. You had to believe. You had to make that decision, right? And people drop everything. We talked about this in the sermon last week about the fishermen. They just quit their jobs and they went with him. But there were probably other people that said no, right? Jesus speaks in parables. And you think about, are there any people that you can remember in the Bible who, in a sense, told Jesus no? The rich man. Anybody else? The rich man earlier, yeah. Many people did. And so it was not uncommon, but that was a difference in it. You couldn't say, well, I'm no longer Jewish. That wasn't a religion. That was a religion. It was a race. It was just kind of use Jewish whether you liked it or not. But that's not the way it is with Christianity. You can be born into a Christian home. Does that make you a Christian? No, you still got to be taught. You still got to make the decision. Now, you may have a leg up on other people, but you're not automatically there. So there's a different type of ministry, if that's the word we want to use. Who? Noah? Okay, yeah. Right. They do. They do, but he wasn't trying to convert them necessarily. He was just trying to convince them that the steps they need. But I would understand that. But I forgot to put the picture up. But you have a picture here of a drawing of a tabernacle, a picture of the law, the commandments there as well. All right, let's go a little further. This is Hebrews chapter 8, verses 7 through 13. Booty, care to read that one? All right. So if we look there at those couple of verses, then we think about at the beginning, it says the first covenant if it had been faultless. Now, I want you to think for just a second about the first cell phone you ever had. Anybody still have, anybody still use the first cell phone you ever had? Pat, do you? You still got the original one? All right. Still, late, Dick. Okay. All right. So let me see this real quick, Dick. This will work out really good. Some of y'all may remember this. After Dick's gonna put this in the museum whenever he leaves after it's over with. Yeah, we got some friends over there. The guy that used to be the football coach at Garrett County had a flip phone just like this as well. Now, my example is losing its power real quick. Nothing wrong with this phone, right? This phone will call point A to point B. But I guarantee there are people in this room who have a phone that is much more capable of that one. But the question is, why did they stop making the phones like Dick has and like Ella has and like everybody has? Why did they stop making those and move on to what maybe somebody else in here has? We're making improvements on them, right? If that phone had been, let's say, faultless, there'd be no need to change it, right? But there was always things that could be improved upon it. I don't know how many we tend to. I've been frustrated. I've been trying to copy my pictures off of my phone onto the computer, which it's the slowest process has ever been because it says you don't have enough space on your phone. The real easy way to fix it is to buy a new phone, but I don't want to pay for another new one. But it describes here the first covenant. It says in verse 7, for if it had been faultless, then what? There would have been no need for a second one. But why were there faults? What were the faults in the original covenant? It didn't forgive sin. It rolled sin forward, but it didn't forgive any kind of sin. What other faults? It was impossible to keep. Any other faults? What do you mean? Oh, of like sacrifice and stuff? Okay. It wasn't very clean. Oddly enough, it was all about cleanliness, but sure. It would have. I think that's no wiggle room. You had, so all of those are good answers there. So when we think about but none of those really fixed anything. You're right. They didn't really they didn't affect you. It was kind of like, there's another chore. I got to do this. I got to do this kind. So there were faults there within it. And when you did it, you were just kind of continuing to, the next time we would do it all over again. And there was not necessarily the buildup, maybe you would say, of the joy that would have been in it. Now, verses 8 through 12, there's a quotation from Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. How does the new covenant then differ from the old? How does the new covenant differ from the old, verses 8 through 12? Yeah. Okay. It's heart-centered rather than sacrificial-centered. That makes sense. How else would the new covenant differ? It's personal. It doesn't. I don't need the high priest. I don't need anybody else. Can I be a Christian and nobody else in my life be a Christian? And I understand that go to church, but I'm thinking can I be a Christian and my wife not be a Christian, or my children or my parents? Of course. Now, might that complicate things? Might it make for some contention? It could, but I can be that. And so that second new covenant there takes it away from sort of the group and makes it the then individual type thing.
And we all have access to the throne through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Before that was possible. You only had access to the priest. He only had limited. Once a year, he could access God.
Right. Right.
So we can go to God. We pray 5,000 times today.
How many of you have talked to God today already? Already said a prayer, right? And if you haven't, it may be you may have sort of a time when you do it, but you're probably going to later if you haven't already. The old law in the Bible, I kind of like the New Testament version because, or not the New Testament, the New King James Version because of the word that it uses, but it says that it makes the first covenant obsolete. That's the word. And I think that's a word that we all can relate to, is something that's obsolete. Do you have anything in your house that's obsolete? Dick, do you have anything? You got anything over there? No, I'm just, all right. So you probably got something that's obsolete, right? What does that mean? Something that is obsolete. It's out of date. It doesn't really work for you anymore. Can you keep it in your house? Can you look at it? Can you think about the good old days with it? But it doesn't work. Okay? It doesn't work. It does not work anymore. The new law made the old law, according to what we read there, obsolete. It wasn't necessary. And the reason it wasn't necessary is it could not do the job anymore. It couldn't do the job anymore. Jimmy, as a farmer, I know you can relate. There's some implements that you're probably pretty glad you have today that they didn't have 100 years ago, right? The stuff they had, they might could do the job, but you'd probably be quitting the job pretty quick if that was the case. And so the new covenant replaces the old one. Yes, ma'am. Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. All right. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. Jimmy, do you care to read this one? All right, now let's remember, Paul here is speaking to Hebrew people. And he's kind of here, I don't really have a question, but what is these 5 verses here in verse 9? What is he sort of telling them? Physical description of the early tabernacle, which would have meant something to these people. This is sort of an ancestral review type thing. Some of you may have things that your grandparents or great-grandparents had. You know, you can sort of refer, or even if you don't, you can think back to what their home was like or something. You can sort of refer back to it. And he's mentioning this. I'm glad he mentions it because it sort of gives us a little bit more information of what it was like. We talked about this back in the Old Testament when we talked about the temple and all of that. I think I used this picture or a picture that was very similar to this. But you have, if this is the front door, as it were, several of the things that were mentioned. You got a menorah here. You've got a table for the showbread. You got a few different things. And then there's this curtain. This is a cross section. So it obviously, this would have draped all the way over, so you couldn't have seen into it from the side. But then there's a second curtain, and only a certain person could go back here. What was that area called, first of all? The most holy place, the holiest of holies, whatever term you want to use right there. Who could go back there? Me and you? No, who could? The high priest. What is this right here? The Ark of the Covenant, and you can see these things on the side. Those of you that may not be able to see that real well, if you think about like a casket with those rails that run along the side that you carry it from point A to point B, that's a rough description. I think it's something like a litter is a term that they would carry kings and queens around on as well. And then there were things inside. There was 3 things mentioned that were inside of the ark. What were the 3 things? We just read it a second ago there, if you want to cheat back. Aaron's rod that budded, the manna, and what else? And the commandments, the tablets that were there. And this was a movable thing. I mean, you can tell here, this is not a building, but rather they use the word tabernacle. What would you call this in today's modern English? Probably a tent, right? You know, that's something that you might camp in, or if you had an auction or something, you might set something up like that for people to look at. But this gives you sort of an idea of what it was. Now let's go a little bit further. Hebrews 9. This is verses 6 through 10. Lucille, do you care to read that? All right. So, who entered the first part of the tabernacle? Just the priest did, entered in to the first part. What was their purpose of going into the tabernacle? What was the priest's purpose for going in? Just the priest, not the high priest, but just the priest. Again, this is from verses 6 through 10, if you want to look back. Sure. Yeah, they performed those types of services. They were who would go into it. They kept it clean. Yes, they did. This notion of sort of, we tend to think about like, on Sunday, I am going to church, right? And we come in here, but you may have class back there and the bathroom is back here, but that's not really the layout of this. There were specific places that you could get to, and then other people could go into that next level. They went and made that sacrifice for you. If you go back into medieval European history, they had what was called a rood screen, not rude as in I'm mean or hateful, but rood, R-O-O-D, that was blocked off the front of the church from the back of the church. And the priest, and we're getting way deep here, could go back there, but the people who were in the church, the congregation, could not. That was in many ways sort of a vestige or a holdover or a manipulation or perhaps just an outright getting it wrong version of how the Old Testament had been. Now, that was the first part of the tabernacle. Who entered the second tabernacle, or second part of the tabernacle? 3 questions. Who entered, how often, and what for? Who went into the second part of the tabernacle? Just the high priest, not even priest A and priest B, but just the high priest. How often did they go? Once a year. Okay, he went once a year. Now, imagine only going someplace once a year, but someplace that you had somewhat ready access to, right? That'd be, I might go to the beach once a year, but that's a long way away. But that was just, it was just on the sort of other side, as it were. No, it was whoever was the high priest, that would be it. What about then, what was the purpose? Why did the high priest have to go into the farthest part or the second part or the back part, whatever word you want to use? Offered sacrifices, blood and goats, what have you. Let's look at verse 9 and 10 again real quick. Verse 9 says it was symbolic for the present time. Now remember, this is being written much, much later to the Hebrew people. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which, what does it say there? Cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. So the person who performed the service, it was gifts and offerings, but it could not make them perfect. If it couldn't make the person who performed the service perfect, what about the people who couldn't even get back there? If it couldn't make that person perfect, was there any hope for you? We talk about it a lot. It's a rolling forward, right? We can kind of roll those sins forward. Here's why, verse 10. Concerned only with what? The New King James says concerned with foods and drinks, right? Physical offerings, various washings. You remember on that map or that picture there a minute ago, there was a bowl that you would, wash your hands or whatever it might be. And fleshly ordinances imposed, but notice that, imposed until the time of what? The time of Reformation. When we talk about the Reformation in my class at school, my world history class, I take a kid's sheet of paper and I wad it up and I give it back to him and I say, reform it. Reformation means to do what? What does it mean to reform? To make new. Something, it has gotten out of whack and it needs to be fixed back. The first law, the original covenant, was food and drink. There were all sorts of these stipulations, but did it do anything for anybody to wipe away their sins completely? No. It was a rolling forward. Jesus would have to play that role. All right. Let's go a little further. Our time is running a little bit thin. Verses 11 through 15. Kevin, do you care to read Hebrews 9, 11 through 15?
For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of the heifer sprinkled and unclean sanctifies from the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance.
So what made the tabernacle brought by Christ greater than the one of the Old Testament? Old covenant, I should say. What made Christ better? He offered himself. He didn't offer what? They said there's several things. What was not offered? Blood of bulls and goats and heifers. And Kevin rattled off several different animals right there, but none of those were the blood that Christ's blood was. Yes. Himself for other people. What allowed Christ to enter the most holy place? Kind of already answered it, but he was sinless. His own blood allowed him to go there. When we talk about the death of Christ upon the cross, what happened to the curtain when Christ died? It was ripped asunder. It was the curtain. There was no more need from the top to the bottom. There was no snipping off the corners. But what does that symbolize? That ripping of the curtain. That you can go if there's a curtain. If you go play and they got a curtain, I mean, I guess you could run up there if you want to, but there's stuff behind there that you can't go into. But when the curtain's open, you can roll in whatever, however you need, whatever you need. And so that curtain, that dividing point, that high priest, yes, was no longer there. That was not a division point any longer. What's the blood of Christ accomplish for you? Washes away your sins. Have we seen any washing away of sins yet today? No. We've seen pardoning, as it were, maybe of sins. We've seen sort of gradual removement, displacement maybe of sins, but we had not seen washing away of sins until when? There you go. Until Christ, until the ability to access the blood of Christ. All right. Yes. Sure. All right, let's go. We got a couple more. Connie, do you care to read verses 16 through 20, please? I'm sorry, 16 through 22. Mm-hmm.
And sprinkled both the book itself, people saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you." Then likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission.
Now, when Moses gives the people the law, then they marched on a little bit, right? When the high priest would go into the holiest of holies and make the sacrifice or whatever, Eventually, he came out and he did whatever his next task had to be. And so these people in the past that had done these tasks were, as we said earlier, sort of men and women, or well, not women, but men like us, but just a regular person, just like a man or woman would be to today. But in verse 16 there, it says that in order for something to truly be passed on, there has to be a what? There has to be a death. This picture here on the screen, how many of you have one of these? You got a will. And what does your will say? I'm not asking for specifics, but what does a will say? What you want done with your stuff. And it could be financial. It could be products or items. It could be land or property or your house or your car. It could be any of those kinds of things. But you have to go through and you say, I want to give this to this person and this to or I want to give this to all of it to one person. I'm going to give it to the church, whatever it might be. But you have one of these. This is a legal document, right? You can't just write a will on a sheet of paper and say, here it is. It has to be what? It has to be notarized. It has to be approved. It has to be accepted. You go through a lawyer to do this. Don't come to me to write a will. I can't do anything about that. But this last will and testament, this idea of being able to send your stuff to wherever it might would be. Why is that necessary? Why is it necessary for there to be a testament? Or what is necessary? Not why, but what is necessary for a testament or a will to be valid? It is part of the law, but what was that? The death of the person. How many of you have had a will written for a long time? Been a while, right? It's been maybe written for a while. But until you pass away, it's not worth it. It's a sheet of paper on file at the courthouse or wherever it might be. Can you change it? Now, what about when you die? Can you change it? Whatever it is what it is, right? But if you go home today and you say, until Dick gets a new phone, I'm changing he doesn't get anything. If you want to go home and think about it that way, you can. But that can be changed. But once the death happens, that's it. So this testament, this new covenant came with what? What had to happen for the new covenant to be put in place? The death of Christ. But what happens to the old will, if you want to think about it that way, when the new one is put in place? It's null and void. You can throw it. I don't know if they throw them away. I don't know if they keep them all. They shred them, whatever it is. But the old one no longer exists. So what about that covenant with Moses when Jesus goes to the cross? It's done away. They didn't have shredders back then, but you get the idea, right? It was put through the shredder. It was no more. It didn't hold any value or any weight for anyone going forward. Sure. Well, yeah, that's not so much a discontinuance as it would be how do I say this? Sort of a wrong turn. Is that the right word? Sort of a tradition-based kind of things as well. That's how they used to do it. That should do it as well. But it becomes, our focus should be on, what is the method that was used. But I understand what you're saying. I don't want to go too deep into it because I'm not, but there is some similarities of this sort of priest and this going to another, the priest plays a role that you can't play. But describes Christians as a priesthood of believers, right? And who are saints in the Bible? Christians. You are a saint and I'm a saint, and there's no statues of me or there's no reverence of me. There shouldn't be, because I'm no more important or less important than you are or anything else. There are people that are in our lives that we would say, oh, she's a saint. We might say that she's greater, and that's our own opinion. There are people that are that way in our opinion, but are we viewed that way in the eyes of the Lord? No. Think about Wednesday night. We talked about Philemon and Onesimus. Onesimus was a what? He was a slave. How was he viewed in the eyes of the church? He was a beloved brother. He was just as important. All right, let's go to the last little bit. Tony, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. Right. Right. I agree. I agree. Now, is there anything wrong with talking with someone in your church about mistakes you've made or problems? Absolutely. I think that's the role that the preacher can play or the elders can play. But that also can be played by an older lady who's been there every single time for the last 70 years. That's a role that kind of comfort can be played as well. If we think back to a couple Wednesday nights ago, Paul was talking to Titus about how to preach to different people and the role that those people in the church would be able to play. That role can be played in many ways as sort of a listening ear or a comfort as well. We've got to finish. We only got like a couple minutes. But Tony, do you care to finish 23 through 28, please? So in chapter 9, it starts with a description of what the tabernacle looked like. Later then in chapter 9, it talks about the things that were done by the priest, the tasks that were carried out, who could do what, and when they could do whatever it is. But when we get to the end of chapter 9, and in particular, verses 27 and 28, it says in verse 27, it is appointed for men what? Once to die, and then what? And after that, the judgment. Now, verse 28, it's not any different for us than anyone else. Remember, we've been talking about making things sort of unique and or be similar and equal. It was offered how often? One time. Offered once to hear the sins of many. To those who eagerly await for him, he will appear a second time. What? Apart from sin, but for what? For salvation. How often did the high priest go in? Once a year. So if you lived to be 90, how many times did the high priest go to work for you? 90 times. How often did Jesus die? One time. He didn't have to die again. He didn't need blood and goats and bulls. It's his blood. But one time he died, and that's how we access it. Now, he'll be back a second time, but for what reason? He ain't come back to die again. He's not more blood. He's coming back for who? To save. That was the lesson that the Hebrews needed to be told. Thoughts?
I can understand their hesitancy and their unwillingness to change.
Yes. 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 Absolutely. It is. There's some similarities here, but it's very much a difference in how things have. That's how we've always done it, so to speak, which we can easily fall into right there. Which one was better? Why? The salvation was possible. Why else is it better? You can keep it one time, right? We talked about the difficulties, the faults of the Old Testament. All of the faults of the Old Covenant are erased by the new one. It is. It absolutely is personal. Absolutely. Absolutely. Pray without ceasing. Absolutely. In the back, they're waving, so I guess that means it's time to be. We got babies. That's my walk-off music at the award show. Thank you all so much.